Welcome to Light Overheat with Professor David Yamani. This week I have the second part of a video I started last week that looks at why scholars, especially public health scholars, see guns adding risk of negative outcomes. Now, a couple of critical comments I have about this work. On the one hand, it, like a lot of the research on guns as a risk factor, focuses on the relative risk rather than the absolute risk, right? So I will take them at their word, the study appears to be sound, that you are 50% more likely to be a homicide victim if you reside with someone who owns a gun than if you don't. Right? That's the relative risk, but the absolute risk is very small. Even in the exposed case, 0.012% of study participants experienced homicide, right? So if you take something that is a rare event, that event doesn't have to increase by very much in order to get a large percentage increase in the risk. So I think we should always bear in mind the absolute risk of some outcome in addition to the relative risk of that, because that goes into this sort of risk-benefit calculus. My second critical point is that these studies that find risk of firearms ownership typically assume that that risk applies equally across all gun-owning households. So if you say that having a gun in your home makes you 2.6 times more likely to be a homicide victim or 5.7 times more likely to be a suicide victim, the assumption is that that additional risk applies across all gun-owning households. But this simply isn't true, and we can see even in Studdart's cohort design on the secondhand risks of gun ownership that the vast majority of people who are homicide victims in this study were women who were victims of intimate partner homicide. So what else is it about those homes that had firearms in them that made that outcome more likely? It wasn't simply the presence of the gun, but there are probably other confounding factors like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, criminal activity, history of violence, right? Things that we know are correlated with intimate partner violence that contributed along with the presence of a gun to that negative outcome, right? So if you're in a gun-owning home in which you don't have those other confounding factors, your risk of being a victim of secondhand homicide is not 1.5 times that of living in a home without a gun. And I think that this sort of level of sophistication and sensitivity too often gets drowned out, again, as we move from some statistic, like 1.5 times, into a political debate or into media coverage. All of that subtlety and nuance is lost. The limitations of this study are admitted in the text of the study, but the conclusions that are drawn and how those conclusions are used oftentimes leave those limitations behind. Now, despite these methodological critiques, I actually do agree with public health scholars that guns can be a risk factor for negative outcomes for certain people under certain circumstances. And if that were always accepted, right, and if the benefits of gun ownership were always accepted, I think that we would have a lot more common ground rather than always moving to polar opposite positions on the issue, right? It's one of the problems with America's great gun debates is a sort of all or nothing approach on both sides, right? So if we look at Arthur Kellerman's work, gun ownership as a risk factor for homicide in the home, one of the most famous public health studies of guns as a risk factor, he and his colleagues conclude that paper saying, in light of these observations and our present findings, people should be strongly discouraged from keeping guns in their homes, right? So this absolutist position and an overdrawn conclusion relative to guns as a risk factor then triggers an equally overdrawn reflexive conclusion drawn by gun owners to say guns aren't a risk factor for negative outcomes. And I believe that neither one of those statements is true. In fact, in a draft of a chapter for my book, Gun Curious, which I'm hoping will be published someday, I write, a gun is designed to propel a projectile in the direction it is aimed, with the projectile damaging whatever it hits, a bird or a deer or a piece of paper or tin can or another human being. Thus, the potential protective benefit of guns needs to be considered in the context of the potential for negative outcomes. And as my friend and one of the most thoughtful gun trainers working in America today, John Johnston, says, before you ever consider any good you might do with a gun, consider all the ways it can go wrong. And this is the exact middle ground that I think we need to have in our great gun debates. We need to understand fully the benefits of gun ownership. We need to understand fully the risks of gun ownership, but we also need to appreciate how those risks can and are being mitigated, and how if you don't mitigate those risks and you get involved with people and activities which increase your risk, whether you own guns or not, in combination with guns, that can be a fatally bad choice. The standard model of the irrationality of defensive gun ownership, I think, overplays its hand in too quickly concluding that defensive gun ownership is irrational. I'm really interested in what your thoughts are. I appreciate if you stayed through this long for my channel video, but please let me know what you think in the comments.